everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Best Practices for Content Cleanup and Data Minimization. We have a great webinar lined up for you today, but before we get started, we want to go over a quick disclaimer. The opinions discussed in today's presentation are those of the individual and do not represent the firms, companies, or entities that they may be affiliated with. So with that, we're going to get started, and I'm going to hand it off to Mark Evans to introduce himself. Mark?
Thanks, Neve, and a warm welcome to everyone. My name is Mark Evans. I'm a Senior Enterprise Sales Engineer for Active Navigation. We're a file analysis software solution provider, and I support all of our pre-sales activities in the commercial area, engaging with our sales team to support proof of concepts and early implementation. Richard.
Oh, thanks, Mark. And I'm Richard Medina. I'm co-founder and principal consultant at Doculabs. We're a strategic consulting company. We focus on information management and information governance. Mark?
Okay, so next slide, please. So I'm going to open up with the question, is bigger always better? And, you know, just a few years ago, the concept of a petabyte of content was a distant horizon. But today, it's really become the new norm for many organizations. And the speed and ease of our ability to create, share, and consume ever-increasing volumes of content, it's increasing at an astonishing rate. And the capacity to process, transmit, and store this content has also increased dramatically. We only have to look at cell phone technology and the rapid shift to cloud computing to see this as real-life examples. However, a large proportion of this content that we're creating is semi-ephemeral. And information utility, and hence the value of that information, for the most part, is starting to diminish at a faster rate over time. And a good example of that is content that we store in messaging and collaboration tools such as email and file shares. Yes, those applications are capturing business decisions and important records, but there's an awful lot of redundant, non-critical content that users create as a byproduct. So, for example, draft copies, working versions, etc. And that creates an additional cost to maintain over time, and also increases the risk of exposure to an organization in terms of maintaining content that's no longer potentially required, maintaining sensitive data beyond its retention period, for example. And so we're seeing a shift to really start to understand what the realized value of information is, as opposed to the more traditional perceived value based off legacy retention rules that most organizations have had in place for several decades. And this means that an organization should really be focused on identifying and removing as much of that redundant, obsolete, and trivial information as part of an information governance strategy. Richard.
Thanks, Mark. So with this chart, you can see a really useful way to picture how, with time, the value of information decreases while the risk of that information increases. So this is a picture of the various types of content you have in your organization. The x-axis shows time from the first 6 months out to about 20 years. The y-axis shows a general scale of quantity, and we'll use that scale for showing an increase or decrease in cost, value, and risk of information. Now the colored lines, kind of that you see there, show the different types of business information that you have, whether it's office documents, product research, financial information, messages, etc. And this is an example curve. It's realistic because it shows the perturbations and so on, the mess that you get with real life. It isn't a smooth curve, but you can see the general trends. The value of all information types decreases, eventually to uselessness, while risk increases over time. You can see the risk to value gap indicated there on the right-hand side. Costs typically stabilize at that cost to value gap that you can see. These are curves, but in the real world, there are some generalities that you can make based on empirical research as to what has happened with email repositories and so on. So, for example, most emails, working, and reference material drops in accesses and value at around 2 years. And then there's often another drop at 7 years, plus or minus, and so on. So that's typically how you align your records retention schedule on when to do disposition and such. Mark?
Next slide, please. Thanks for that, Richard. So let's spend a short while thinking about the typical makeup of an organization's content. And if we boil it up to the top level, there's really two primary types of content being created and managed throughout an organization, and that's what we call structured and unstructured data. Structured data is typically transactional based, and it's stored and managed in robust applications. And those applications, by their very nature, lend themselves to having built-in data governance capabilities through managed access policies and information architecture controls. Structured data, however, can be highly unmanaged. Think of email, personal file shares, SharePoint sites, etc. Those locations are used typically for drafting and manipulation of content. And once such activities are complete, that working content often remains in place, becomes stale and untouched. And in essence, there's often very little information governance applied to many of these sources, including policies around content creation, sharing, and storage of that content. As you can see from the graphic on the left, a recent Gartner report indicates that typically 80% of an organization's content resides in unstructured data sources. As mentioned earlier, more and more generated content has reduced utility over time, and typically up to a third of this content has not been accessed in 3 years or more. And as you can see from the third graphic on the right, there's a shift in an ever-increasing desire to develop holistic information governance programs that cover both structured, semi-structured, and unstructured data. Next slide, please. So this leads us on to the concept of data minimization. So what do we mean by that? So fundamentally, it's about limiting the content an organization creates or collects in order to perform the business functions. And once that business function is complete, the content should be disposed of as soon as possible if it's no longer needed or there's no regulation mandate or policy in place to retain it beyond its business purpose. And adopting this approach, it significantly reduces the risk an organization could be faced with if content is misused or exposed outside of the organization. And you know, prior to the creation of file analysis tools like Active Navigation's Discovery Center, this approach to data minimization, it wasn't really possible or cost effective. It was very challenging to identify stale content sources, for example, or content that was outside of its retention policy or draft content if it's outside of a true management system and residing on unstructured content sources. So the advent of such tools like this is now started to enable organizations to really focus on data minimization as both a cost reduction effort and a risk reduction effort. Richard.
Excellent. Next slide, please. Okay, so what exactly is this content cleanup and disposition? Well, the purpose of content cleanup and disposition is to help organizations dramatically improve the management and governance of their information, specifically in terms of defensibility, discovery, findability, and compliance. It focuses on identifying and then deleting or securing a bunch of different types of content. First, your high-risk information, such as sensitive data like personal health information, called PHI, personally identifiable information, PII, payment card industry information, PCI, and intellectual property. It also focuses on identifying, deleting, and securing high-value content, such as what you use to run the business, your business records, and so on. The next category that it works on is orphaned and abandoned content. This is content files without an identifiable owner. That is, the owner of the files has left the company or moved to a different position, or that area has been dissolved in the organization. So it's just sitting there without anyone managing it, disposing of it, etc. And then finally, stale content, junk content, and duplicates, which are all easy to understand, but form the bulk of the the content that's on your systems. Now, most cleanup initiatives focus primarily on the Microsoft environment. So that's your network shared drives, Microsoft SharePoint and Office 365, and email, which often have the lowest control of content creation and sharing and storage. This responsibility has been typically pushed out to the businesses, been decentralized, and therefore not done well. The cleanup can also address legacy content systems, such as your enterprise content management systems, ERP systems, HR systems, and your line of business systems, most of which manage structured, that is database information, and our database applications. We're primarily going to be focused on the Microsoft environment in this talk. And finally, note that we're focusing here mainly on a one-time historical cleanup, just to make things simple in this talk. As you may know, the best way to address large problems is to break them into smaller, more practical problems. With content cleanup, there are two big problems. One is the disposition of historical information, all the terabytes that you have up till now, and then the disposition on a day-forward basis as you create new ROTT. For simplicity, this webinar will target historical information. But once you tackle that problem, it's much easier to do ongoing hygiene on your documents and other information. One of the recommendations that we'll be making is, as you embark on cleanup, is to do a business case. And to do that, you have to understand the problems that you're solving and the benefits that content cleanup provides you with in solving the problems. Best way to talk about the problems of unmanaged content is in terms of cost, risk, effort, and risk. And so here are just some highlights as to what's probably happening in your own enterprise. First, cost. Content growth can be as much as 20% year over year, leading to increased data storage costs, despite the general decrease in storage costs. But you add backup and administration and so on. And then there's the additional cost of discovery for regulatory or litigation purposes. And outside counsel review on terabytes of irrelevant data is very expensive. Mark, do you have anything to say about the benefits?
Yeah, so the benefits of implementing a data minimization approach in terms of cost are obviously if you're reducing the footprint of your unstructured data, you're going to reduce the cost to maintain that over time. And just to give you a kind of an empirical example, if an organization, say, had 100 terabytes of unstructured data, and they were seeing a 20% year-on-year annual growth of that, by putting in a data minimization approach, typically we can realize a cost avoidance of around $14 million over a 5-year period. And then, of course, with the ever-increasing costs of outside counsel review, we're typically seeing the review costs of that anywhere between $5,000 and $30,000 per gigabyte of data to conduct that review. So clearly there's huge cost savings there if one is able to substantially reduce that footprint.
Now a few points about effort. With too much unmanaged content, employees can't, it has dramatic impact on effort, the effort to manage the information. And that is, for example, and use the information. Employees can't easily find the content they need as they sift through all the content they don't need. And secondly, I mentioned e-discovery before. E-discovery gets dramatically more difficult when content is over-retained past its regulatory or business use life. And then two more I want to mention. One is that information security has a harder time protecting the crown jewels when they're mixed in with the high volumes of junk and stale content. And then, of course, disaster recovery and automated jobs like backup is much more difficult and takes more time with too much content. Mark?
Yeah, so by removing all of the e-trash, the ROTT, and the non-business content, you're reducing your content to that's highly relevant to the business. And so some nice side effects of that are that downstream, you're fundamentally improving the findability of that content for employees. They're not having to sift through all of the junk. They're able just to focus on the content of interest. In addition, your e-discovery efforts are very much reduced due to the reduced number of documents that you're managing. And information security now has tight insights into where the sensitive data is located, what the volume of that is, and what the perceived risk of that. And it makes their life so much easier to protect those valuable high-at-risk assets over time. And in addition, any disaster recovery and automated processing that's taking place, again, will be completed in less time because you've got a very much reduced volume of content to be dealing with. Rich?
And then the final category is that of risk. And so over-retention of sensitive or confidential data, particularly sensitive data like PII or PHI, can lead to increased fines in the case of a data breach. Second, non-compliance with your corporate policies can make it much more difficult to defend your organization's conduct with regulators and the public. The cliche is that it's better not to have a policy than to have a policy that you're not following. And then finally, cybersecurity insurance may not pay claims in the case of non-compliance with organizational policies or specific insurance policies. Mark, do you have anything to say about risk?
Yeah, so by having a nice, clean content source and by removing all of that orphan data, you're highly likely to reduce the amount of fines if you ever were to suffer a data breach because you've got tighter controls in place around that content and it's well known. And also by cleaning up the content through those initiatives, you're demonstrating a good faith effort in terms of defending your conduct with regulators around privacy regulations and also data breach regulations.
Excellent. Can we go to the next slide? And now we'll get into how to reap those benefits. So what you have here is a picture of what we found to be a very effective methodology for cleanup and remediation. As you can see, it has three major phases: discover, plan, and remediate. And as I mentioned before, we're focusing on historical cleanup, but ongoing cleanup is easier because you don't have to duplicate most of the discovery and planning work. So let's go to the next slide and dig in. Okay. We're going to talk now about the discover phase and each of its four tasks. I'll go over them briefly, and Mark and I, as we go through, may pick out some more interesting pieces of each of the tasks. But the first task is actually a little counterintuitive, possibly. You might think that you have to plan, do a lot of discovery first, but actually, the best practice is just to jump in and do an initial simple scan on your drives, on your email repository, wherever you first start. And this will give you enough information to get rolling on the later steps. So you conduct an initial scan of the information stored in your repositories using content analytics software like ActiveNav to identify ROTT data and to identify the locations of your sensitive data, risky data like PHI or PII. And so what you'll get in this initial superficial scan is a preliminary analysis of the volumes and the nature of the content that you're dealing with. And so you can start planning. The second piece is to do a data map. And this, Mark will discuss this in more detail, but to develop a data map, you combine the output of the first easy scan you just did with your top-down organizational knowledge about your files. And with both of those, you create an inventory of your content storage locations, your content types, the formats, and so on. And that inventory will help you drive decision-making and prioritize what type of remediation you'll be doing. The third piece, we're not going to talk about too much today. That application inventory really pertains to your legacy and not other non-Microsoft systems that have databases and so on. But you typically inventory them as well if you want them to be in scope. And the fourth step, which is very important for this talk, is to get stakeholder and authority alignment, to get the budget. It's the ask. So you identify and you work with cross-functional stakeholders to assign responsibilities and accountability for data remediation and migration and disposition. And you'll figure out what the rights and responsibilities will be for, and the roles for, and to start developing a racing matrix. And what you'll get is delegated authority for taking action and hopefully taking the next steps. Mark?
Yeah, next slide, please. So as Rich mentioned, the data map is a key activity in the discovery phase. And without an effective data map, it really makes downstream remediation that much harder. So data map can be informed by a tool like Discovery Center, which will give you a high-level understanding of what data you currently have and where the concentrations of that data are across the organization. So it's a good start point then to what really leads into a soft activity. And the first aspect here is really to get a better handle in terms of generating a repository inventory. So that's really documenting all of the major content repositories that are out there, their key attributes, and whether or not they're in scope for downstream remediation activities. And so the inventory then is a documentation of all of those repositories. And in order to do that, you're really going to have to engage with many stakeholders across your organization. And those may include the repository owners, records and legal compliance, IT, information governance, and the repository owners themselves, in order to build up that inventory and determine whether or not those systems are in scope. And it's really also understanding what kinds of records and types of information are maintained in those systems and the way in which they're being measured. So typical information that you would collect would be the repository name, the owner of that repository, the number of files, the volume that repository is taking up in terms of storage, and the record types that are being managed, and any metadata that's also there that may contain sensitive information, for example. So the output of the data map is that inventory. And that then informs the next stage in the process, which is planning. Okay, now Rich is going to take you through the stakeholder authority and alignment step.
Thanks, Mark. Next slide, please. Excellent. So the last task in the discover phase is to get stakeholder and authority alignment. Now, obtaining approval can be daunting at times, depending on the hierarchy of your organization and the processes that are used to formalize the work. But below are some examples of steps that can be taken to get approval in no particular order. First, I would say what you've got to do, next slide please, is to develop and circulate a business case. We got you started talking about cost, effort, and risk, and those are good buckets to try to assign numbers to. Defining the problem that benefits your cleanup will provide your organization are critical to set the stage for discussions with management. And the benefits must be clearly stated, as Mark did when I noted the problems, whether it's risk, cost savings, effort savings, and so on. One target area which we find to be very useful is to look at policies, the policies and policies in your organization that you are mandated to fulfill. And typically either you have policies in place, but you are not effectively fulfilling them, or you don't even have the policies in place. If the policies are mandatory and you must fix the policies and adhere to them, cleanup can be a necessary condition for that and help you build a solid business case. Second, I would say identify the key stakeholders that you must win over to get funding and staff resources to do the required cleanup work. Make sure to tailor your message to appeal to each stakeholder. This is a little bit cheesy, but there are typically 4 types of stakeholders that you'll find: champions, decision makers, influencers, and blockers. The champions help you get to yes. They may or may not have the power to say yes, but they know how to navigate the organization and they will help you. The decision makers are typically risk averse and will be weighing multiple requests for approval and budget and so on. They will rely on input from the champions and influencers to aid in the decision-making process. The influencers are often accountable for the financial impacts and ROI for the projects. They can be very helpful to you as you're building the business case. And the blockers are bad news. they typically don't have the power to say yes, but they give decision makers reason to say no. Why should we do cleanup? We're just going to be, moving to the cloud with Office 365, and we can just migrate our content or start fresh. We don't need to do cleanup. That's the sort of thing that you hear. And then finally, what I would say is, fifth, is don't make your plan a big reveal at the end of a mystery novel. Work with all the stakeholders ahead of time to plan out and to understand what's going to happen in that final approval meeting. So you get everyone in place, everyone on board, you address all the concerns of the blockers, and then you go to the no-go meeting. Next slide, please. Okay, so next we're going to move to the second phase, which is the planning phase, after you've done the discovery work. The first piece of this is to update your policies and procedures. So what you'll do is you'll review your existing information management policies, procedures, and guidelines. And these policies will be you might have a RIM policy, Records and Information Management Policy, or an Information Lifecycle Management Policy, a Records Management Policy. You'll have various security policies. You'll have various procedures for disposing of content and so on. You review those, you identify their gaps. You can consult with legal and compliance to get their perspective on what your policy needs will be with GDPR and so on. And based on these inputs, update or create new policies and procedures as needed. One policy that's almost always neglected is an orphaned and abandoned data policy. So as I mentioned in the very beginning, this addresses the data that's left without an owner because the owners moved on to another organization, another area in the organization, or has just abandoned his or her responsibilities. The challenge is you're going to uncover a lot of abandoned data, and you must have a procedure for what to do with it. And so the specifics will vary with every organization, but at its core, you'll have language like the following. Any files that haven't been accessed in X number of years, might be 2 years, 3 years, whatever, will be considered orphan data. In other words, not having no business owner. The information management team, that's you, will take ownership of all orphan data and will be responsible for managing it through its remaining life cycle, including disposition, which would be deletion or permanent archival. And so you have that piece in place. You make sure none of these policy sub-pieces conflict with any of the others, and then you get rolling on the procedures. Now, the procedures are the next step, and those are for cleanup and day-to-day management in the information lifecycle. And you'll have procedures for determining what you don't want to keep, what you do want to keep, for how to set and follow a regular retention schedule, and so on. I just talked about policy and procedures and how to update them. The next two pieces are your playbook and your work plan. The playbook is the recipe, the set of instructions for doing the cleanup and disposition. And the work plan is the schedule for who goes first, who goes second, and so on.
Okay, so everything Richard's talked about in the discovery and the planning phase is really done at the enterprise level. And it's really crucial to do that in order to set the success for the remediation phase, which comes next. And this is where now we start to take a departure. We're doing this at a finer grain level. We typically do this at the department level, and it's now where we start to use technology as an enabler to put in place the remediation strategies that have been defined in the planning phase. And so it's really important that we do this in consort with the data disposition playbook that's been created and that remediation work plan. This is a phased approach. We're not trying to boil the ocean in one go, and best practices has shown this to be a very effective mechanism to put in place for successful remediation. So this is now where we're going to start cleaning up the content. And it really starts by, first of all, running a detailed scan at the department level based on what's been defined in that data disposition playbook. And so different departments may get different levels and different details of scanning depending on the nature of the content that is of relevance in each department. And so the outputs from that initial scan will be a detailed report, which can then be used in consort with the content owners for actually making remediation decisions. So those reports are going to tell you the level of ROTT in each department, the locations of sensitive data and the sensitive data types that have been found, and any other privacy-related or sensitive data that may need further consideration. So once we have that report, once we've had a review with the department owners and all of the relevant stakeholders, it's then time to get approval for the disposition of that and to actually implement the disposition using the technology to take actions in place. So using the tool that has provided the scan to then reach back into those content sources and actually implement the disposition decisions that have been approved. And so the output from that is that your unnecessary files will be destroyed. They will have been remediated. Clearly then there's some additional remediation which may need to take place, which may require more manual review, including an assessment of the sensitive data that's been found, potentially updating and the global access control rules around who has access at what degree to the content that you're maintaining over time. And then coming out of that, you now have more formalized information governance in place across the relevant content that your organization is managing. An additional step in the remediation may be that organizations would like to move the content from the fairly unstructured sources today, like file shares, into a more managed environment like SharePoint Online or content servers. And so it's important then to think about that migration pathway. And in addition to migrating the content, consideration needs to be made for migrating the metadata as well. Not all organizations fulfill the data migration, but it's an additional step that does warrant consideration when you're developing an overall methodology. Okay, so just a real-world example. Having worked with over 100 different organizations across different business verticals in finance, healthcare, retail, etc., we've typically found that on average, an organization is able to reduce their footprint by around about 40%, and that includes the ability to remove ROTT and duplicate content and move sensitive data into a more secure location. And we're able to realize results like this in a relatively short time frame across an organization. And what this then does is it leads to a more efficient approach downstream of creating more targeted analysis for sensitive data and the ongoing classification of content against targeted information architectures that really do fit into an overarching information governance program. Richard.
Thanks. Next slide, please. Excellent. So one piece not to neglect is to prepare for change management because you're going to be messing with a lot of folks' lives. You're going to impacting how people work, and you must let them know the expectations and benefits and timing for successful adoption when they're cleaning up their shared drives and their SharePoint folders and so on, and moving that stuff over possibly to a new systems. I just want to focus on two best practices here. The first I've mentioned twice before in this talk, and that is to start with a RACI. That is a chart that lets everyone know who is responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. And that'll help eliminate confusion and set forth the requirements of the various individuals across the organization. The second is, you can see there in the bullet, I say, develop a stakeholder communications matrix. In English, what that is a spreadsheet which helps you organize the kinds of messages and communications you're providing to the organization. So you list out the various types of audience members, based on the RACI, and then what campaign you're going to do, which just means, are you introducing them to remediation, or is a particular kind of training or whatever, what the actual message or training module is, what outcome you want from them, whether you want them to complete a task or do nothing or just stay informed, what medium it's going to be, whether it's a brown bag lunch or formal training or an online thing, and then with what frequency you're going to do it, whether it's a refresher every month during a meeting or it's a one-time thing. Those two things really have been a good handle on the RACI, and also providing communications based on a communications matrix are very effective at helping you with change management. Mark? And next slide, please.
Thanks, Richard. So I'd really wanted just to wrap up with a few conclusions and then open up the floor for any questions that you may have for the two of us. So, you know, fundamentally, we really should be thinking about this early as possible in the information management lifecycle. And it's really critical to build in these concepts that we've talked about today during the earliest phases of when you're either accumulating data from outside or creating data as part of business processes. And it's important to ask some really soul-searching questions in those early phases. Get a good understanding of why an organization might be retaining certain types of information in the first place. Is there a pressing need to hold on to that for an extended period of time? Identify those content sources that you are able to dispose of in a timely fashion. And it's all about reducing risk, okay? The less information that you collect and store and manage, the less you're going to be exposed to many of the risks that we talked about throughout this webinar. And ongoing, acquire that data progressively, and only when you need it, acquire it and maintain it. And from an implementation standpoint, from putting in place the data minimization strategy, it's really about those key steps of planning, thinking through your data landscape, creating an inventory of your data sources, developing that playbook, and then going through the remediation process at a lower level of granularity in terms of organizational size, doing that deep scan, identifying those areas of risk, and then taking advantage of technology to perform that for you or support that, and then implement those actions through your agreed disposition policy and processes. So from that point, I think that concludes our piece of this webinar, and I'd like to hand it back to Neve, who's just going to give us some information about some follow-on resources.
Great. Well, thank you, Mark and Richard, for that great presentation. Certainly lots to think about, especially around stakeholder authority and alignment. Like you said, Richard, it shouldn't be a mystery novel. So to help get you started with content cleanup and data minimization practices, along with this webinar, we've also put together a helpful 15-page ebook, which is packed full of tips and tricks. And we'll share this ebook in a follow-up email along with this recording as soon as it's over. So right now we're going to be tackling questions. So Richard and Mark's contact information is on the screen now, so you can either follow up with them directly, but I have seen some questions come through now, so we're going to jump right in. So I see one that says there's been a huge growth in data privacy regulations such as CCPA. So how can content cleanup and data minimization help with compliance with regulations like that?
Mark, do you want to take it first, or do you want me to take it?
Yeah, I'll jump in. So, yeah, great question. And, you know, this is a really hot topic. The regulations are now starting to appear. California's fairly far down the road in terms of developing theirs and releasing it to the community. And what they're telling us is the responsibilities of an organization in terms of how they're managing sensitive and private information and how they have to fulfill requests for disclosure of that information. And what a tool like a Discovery Center can do, it can help an organization understand where those sources are throughout their data landscape. And so it can narrow down where organizations have to look in terms of fulfilling those requests. So it gives very quick insights and points organizations to the relevant sources in order to be able to fulfill those requests. Do you want to add, Richard?
Sure, and that was a great answer. I'll do a simple one, and that is cleanup analysis and cleanup helps you identify where the PII is, helps you remediate it. It's first necessary to identify it. The smaller payload, the smaller, cleaner repositories you have make it easier to control and access your PII. And then you've got the confidence of effectively managing it, retaining it, destroying it, and so on. So it's one of the best use cases for it.
Great, fantastic. Thank you for that. So we've got another one which says, we would like to use last access to identify ROTT, but our understanding is that in the Microsoft world, the created and last modified dates are accurate, but the last access dates are not, since they are affected by system processes like backup and virus scanning. Is that correct? And is there a way around that?
That's a great question. We get asked this quite a lot when we're engaging with clients. So the observation is correct. So in the Microsoft world and in other file system worlds, the three primary dates that are captured as metadata are the creation date, last modified, and last access. And the person who asked the question is quite right. Those can get changed by processes that have occurred on the content. So for example, if a file has been migrated from a legacy application to a new file system, invariably what happens is that the creation date gets set to the date of migration. So it becomes kind of a red flag to the real creation date. What we tend to find is that of the three dates, the last modified is the most trusted. So through that example that I gave you, the migration example, the modified date is preserved. The access date, as the questioner indicated, can also get changed by processes. So if there's a backup or there's a virus scan, as the two examples that we used, it is true that access date, even if a file is just is touched and copied, it can change that date as well. So from our perspective, what we always recommend to users of our technology when they're identifying ROTT based on a date function is that they base it on the last modified. So for example, if they're looking for aged content that's in their organization that potentially is beyond the retention policy, base that off the last modified date.
Great, fantastic. And then what is maybe one of the best publicly available studies you guys may have seen that calculates ROTT reduction cost savings due to lower storage costs?
Mark, you might know of one. I do not. What we usually use is publicly available. They're standard formulas and standard costs, and then you can plug in just a ballpark T-shirt size estimate of what the individual organization is interested in, and from that you can pop out the typical cost and cost benefit and so on. Maybe you know of a publicly available study, Mark.
Yeah, we do. In our platform, you can associate costs with various tiers of storage that the system's connected to. So that might be flash storage, might be network attached storage or cloud storage. I don't have any shareable metrics right now to hand that are real world examples, but from the experiences that we've been involved in kind of proof of concepts and early production projects, we mentioned this in the webinar, we typically see around about 40%. And that's both in volume and file counts, and then analogous to that is cost.
And so if I can, excellent. And if you, caller, if you email either of us, or both of us will send you some material on it. And that might be sufficient to meet your needs, get you rolling.
Fantastic. And then I think we have time for another couple that have come in. So do you have any recommendations for initial orientations or even a questionnaire to help gauge the relative level of comfort stakeholders have in relation to file analysis technology and or records management when starting a project?
Rich, do you want to take that first, or I can jump in?
Usually, and this might be questionnaire, send us an email and we'll send you one. It usually starts with a survey monkey or with an interview and with a general set of questions. Do you know what your policies are? Do you have any policies? Do you delete information and so on? That's across the board, all the users, but then you are more targeted when you're talking about the stakeholders and champions to build the business case and so on. And there you're much more focused. Mark?
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think part of the methodology that we talked about was that initial phase of building out a data map, and that can help to understand what the relative level of comfort is. If you're generating that and you're seeing areas within your business that have high levels of content that could really benefit from a data minimization approach, then you've got direct evidence in hand to take to those relevant stakeholders that may be interested in realizing cost savings through that data minimization activity.
So the most frequent question we get asked is how there's a little twist on the question, and that is how do you convince reluctant organizations to dip their toe in this, or even maybe if they're moving to the cloud or something to get jettison 40% of their content. And you identify first, and so I'll address this. You first identify stakeholders and so on, so see who's amenable to a quantitative business case. And then you look at the business case is fairly straightforward. You look at the IT admin costs of over-retention. You look at the operational inefficiencies of over-retention, and by that I mean day-to-day user delays and so on, and messing around with a lot of documents all over the place. You look at the legal discovery costs of over-retention, and that comes in two parts. One, the cost of doing discovery, that's kind of operational for how difficult discovery is with a large payload. And then secondly, the penalty cost, if there are any. And you can work up a pretty good business case for being able to do it. And then if the business units who want to clutch to their documents are still reluctant to get rid of them, you can do an easy scan, as Mark has been saying, and that can show you that, you know what, after 2 years, after 3 years, there really isn't a lot of use. You're not really hitting these documents at all. And so that can convince them. And worst case, as a compromise, you might grab those documents and put them into a shadow archive, into another bucket, and then eat away at them, gradually dispose of them, while you're keeping your main repositories pure.
Great, fantastic. So I think we have time for one more question, and that is, how far along is the industry in creating dynamic or automated data maps?
This is another great question. So the concept of a data map is gaining popularity day by day. It's becoming important in other areas. So NIST has just released a data privacy framework, and a big component of that is data maps. And so we're starting to see a lot of interest in this area, and quite naturally a lot of interest in using technology to help facilitate the automated generation of that. Within our tool, we have a couple of ancillary utilities that can go out and profile an organization's network to identify in an automated fashion where some of those content sources are, and there are many other tools out there that do that kind of get that technical infrastructure perspective of a data map, that's the first step. You can supplement that with Discovery Center to get more detail from that data map in terms of how many files are sitting out there in each of the locations, how many folders, what's the nature of that content regarding its extension. And then that typically right now is being supplemented by some of the software elements You know, what are the business records in there? What is the focus of that content storage in terms of supporting the business? So we're moving in a direction that's becoming more and more automated as time marches on.
Great, fantastic. Well, as we get closer to the top of the hour, I just want to say thank you so much to yourself, Mark and Richard, for this great presentation. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. Like we said, we will be sharing a link to the recording of this webinar, along with answers to any questions that we didn't get to today, and also that ebook to help get you started. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you.